If there is one thing that causes a lot of confusion in resource management, it is trying to understand the difference between resource capacity planning and resource planning. So today I'm going to explain the differences between these two important resource management techniques, and just a heads up about terminology. To keep things simple, I will be talking about projects today. But if you use product-based planning, for example, everything I talk about here can also be applied. First, let's start with a definition of each. Capacity planning is the process of determining if you have sufficient resources with the right skills to do the projects you want to do. This involves looking at the resource requirements of your projects and comparing to the supply or capacity of your resources. Capacity planning is sometimes called resource forecasting or demand forecasting. Resource planning is the process of assigning actual people resources to projects. It involves finding the best person for the project based on skills and availability. Resource planning is sometimes called resource allocation. While resource planning and capacity planning share certain similarities, they help answer different questions. Capacity planning answers three basic questions. Can your organization take on additional work? Do you have the necessary resources to complete your committed work? And do you need to change things around? For example, hire more people or defer or cancel projects. Resource planning also answers three basic questions. Who should be allocated to each project? When should they be allocated? How much work can they be allocated? Now let's look at some of the key differences between resource capacity planning and resource planning. Capacity planning is used to assess if you have the right level of resources with the right skills to get your projects done. And the output will be decisions about hiring, project timings, and new project approvals. With resource planning, the output will be decisions about who is working on what projects and when. Capacity planning is a high-level strategic tool, normally used by decision makers or the PMO, whereas resource planning has an operational focus and is normally used by resource managers or team leads. Capacity planning is done at the skill team level. It does not concern itself with individual people, whereas resource planning is done using named resources or actual people. Finally, capacity planning has a long-range focus, normally months, whereas resource planning has a shorter range focus. These last 2 points are particularly important, but the areas that organizations often get wrong. So let's dive into these in a little more detail. An important difference between capacity planning and resource planning is the level of detail it is performed at. Capacity planning is done at the team or skill level. For each project, you record the skills or teams needed, when and how much work is required. This is known as resource demand, and you compare this to the resource capacity of the skills or teams. The end game is to select and time projects so that you have neither a shortfall nor oversupply of resources. Once you have a balanced capacity plan, the next step is to allocate actual people to each project you have committed to do. This is resource planning. As you allocate people, you monitor their utilization levels and adjust schedules as necessary. Next, let's consider the time frames over which resource planning and capacity planning operate. A resource plan covers who is working on what over the coming weeks, whereas a capacity plan is typically looking many months ahead. When it comes to where resource planning ends and capacity planning takes over, there is no right or wrong answer, but here are some things to consider. Your capacity plan needs to broadly match your hiring and onboarding timescales, as your capacity plan is going to inform your hiring. Your capacity plan also needs to tie in with your project selection process, as you need to understand your resource capacity so you can make decisions on what projects you can approve. Because resource planning is done at the level of individual resources, you will be juggling a lot more data, which eats up a lot of time and effort. And resource plans are also more likely to change frequently as projects slip and things move around. So try and keep your resource planning timeframes as short as possible to minimize work. Now let's consider how resource capacity planning and resource planning work together. Resource planning and capacity planning do go hand in hand. You can't agree to take on new projects or agree when projects can happen unless you know you've got enough people to complete them. And you can't complete your projects until you've worked out who's available to work on them and when. So it's not really a question of should you do resource capacity planning or resource planning. You really need to do both. Thank you for watching today. And if you're looking for a software solution for resource planning or capacity planning, please head over to clue.com and sign up for a free trial of our resource management solution. And please check in the descriptions below for further links about resource management.